off to Gordon.
Thank you. So I want to take you back to September of 1991, which might be before some of you were born, possibly, or at least very early on in your lives. It was somewhat later for me. And I want to take you back here, which is the University of Hull, and actually more specifically here, which is Thwaite Hall and the Hall of Residence that I was in at the time. I'd come back from a long summer break and I had an assignment that was due to be handed in at 4 p.m. on the first Wednesday of term. And we'd been given the assignment before the summer holidays, so I'd had plenty of time to get books out of the library, to do my research, and to produce my 5,000-word dissertation. But here's the problem. You remember I said it was due in at 4 p.m. on first Wednesday of term? It's currently 10 p.m. on Tuesday, the night before it's due in. I haven't got any books out before the summer, and now they're all checked out to other people. And before all you youngsters say, but you could just Google it. You do remember what year I said this was, don't you? 1991. The modern internet didn't exist. The first publicly available web browser, Mosaic, wasn't available until January of 1993. And this was about as advanced as computers got on campus, down in the main computer room. And in fact, in my hall of residence, this was all there was. So no Googling it. I'm staring at a blank sheet of paper with just my course book and the dissertation question, wondering how on earth I'm going to get 5,000 words written before the deadline tomorrow. And yes, I did say written. Not only did I not have the internet, I didn't have a computer or even a typewriter. What I did have was this, which was an old school filter coffee machine that my parents had given me for my room. None of your fancy lattes here. So I brewed a whole very strong pot and drank it whilst I tried to figure out what I was going to write. And when I say drank it, I mean I drank all of it. I had the caffeine shake so bad that I couldn't sit still enough to hold the pen. And I had to go for a walk in the halls of the garden until they wore off. So it was probably close to midnight before I actually properly got started on the dissertation, and I wrote through the night and into the following day. Tired and bleary-eyed, I went down to the campus, bought the spiral binding that I needed, and put my dissertation in the box at 3:55 p.m. So yes, I made it on time, and for those of you wondering, I got a reasonable grade for it. So why am I telling you this particular story? Well, as you'll see, this is basically the story of my biggest challenge with ADHD, which is procrastination. But the thing is, back then, I didn't know that ADHD was the cause. I just thought it was some kind of moral failure. So how did I realise that leaving things to the last minute is not just me being lazy and undisciplined? To explain that, meet my son, Ari. Now, Ari's transgender and, as you can see, is also a wheelchair user. And in May of 2022, Ari was diagnosed as being autistic and also having ADHD. And since I wanted to understand more about his condition, I did what I'm sure probably most of us would do in this situation and consulted Dr. Google. And through my research, I realised that autism and ADHD have quite a strong hereditary component. And having looked at the characteristics, the parent most likely for passing those traits on is me. So although I do think I do have some autistic traits, what I want to focus on today is ADHD. Now, quick question. Who can tell me what ADHD stands for? Please feel free to unmute and just shout out. Who knows what ADHD stands for?
Come on, guys, get involved.
Is the first one attention?
Yep. Attention deficit hyperactive disorder, I think.
Yeah, pretty much. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And when you think of ADHD or somebody that's got ADHD, what's the stereotypical example that most people think of when they think of ADHD? Perhaps in child.
Can't keep still, moving about, yeah, fidgeting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that noisy, overly energetic, disruptive little boy who loves to jump off high things, driven by emotion and can't seem to pay attention to anything for more than about 5 seconds. Which is true, that is one type, but it's only one example of what ADHD actually is. And also what I learned is that calling it attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is also actually quite misleading, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, before I go any further, I am not an expert, okay? Everything I'm telling you today is just my personal experience and understanding from what I've discovered rather than authoritative information. But with that disclaimer out of the way, let's start with a brief explanation of what ADHD actually is. So the short explanation is it's an executive dysfunction disorder, but not that kind of executive dysfunction, this kind. But to understand what executive dysfunction is, we need to know what executive functioning is. So I'm going to read you a definition. Executive functioning is a set of cognitive skills that drive goal-oriented behavior and are critical to the ability to adapt to an ever-changing world. It's a complicated mess that makes up one part of your overall cognitive functioning, and when it's impaired, it can cause issues with motivation, short-term memory, impulse control, planning, organization, fluency, so that's reading, writing, or talking, and so much more. Basically, it's the bit of your brain that helps you adult. So when I say I can't adult, that's when your executive function is impaired. It's primarily recognized as the main issue in ADHD and also in autism spectrum disorders. And people that have got these conditions have impaired executive functioning. It also impacts people who've got depressive disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, and probably a whole lot more. And there's actually 3 types of ADHD. And these prevalence figures I'm going to tell you are from the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE. The first is hyperactive impulsive, that little boy stereotype that we were talking about a moment ago. But that actually makes up about 15% of cases where they're exclusively hyperactive impulsive. The second is inattentive ADHD. It's what used to be called just ADD, so attention deficit disorder without the hyperactivity bit. And that accounts for about 20 to 30% of cases. And the third type is combined subtype, which accounts for the remaining kind of 50 to 75%. As for me, I'm predominantly inattentive, although I do have some elements of impulsivity. So what's the difference between them? Well, we know what hyperactive impulsive looks like. That's the little boy stereotype. So let's have a look at some of the characteristics of the inattentive type. It manifests as limited attention span, distractibility, forgetfulness, and my big one, procrastination. People who've got inattentive ADHD can make careless mistakes because they have difficulty sustaining focus, following detailed instructions, and organising tasks and activities, and they're easily distracted by external stimuli. So it's like, oh, squirrel, so not the dog, me. Might also leave projects unfinished and might also appear not to be listening to you when you're talking. And these are all symptoms of inattentive type ADHD. They are not personal defects. They are not moral failures. Now, I said earlier on that calling it attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is somewhat misleading. It's actually better thought of as ARD, attention regulation disorder. In other words, it's not a lack of attention, it's a lack of control of that attention. So for people like me, attention is like a spotlight. But here's the problem. I'm not fully in control of where that spotlight is pointing. Sometimes I really want to point it in a particular direction, but it just won't stay on it. Maybe it's something boring or challenging, or I'm just not interested. Sometimes I really want to stop pointing it at something, but I can't break attention and get my attention off it. And sometimes I might really need to do something, even something as basic as get up and go to the loo. And I kid you not, this is quite a common problem with people that have ADHD, sort of personal care or brush your teeth. But it feels like I'm stuck to the couch. Now, some of you, if you haven't got ADHD, might be listening to this and thinking to yourself, oh, so what? We're all like that sometimes. And yes, we all have days where we don't want to get off the sofa, we forget something, we don't want to do something that's boring, or we act on impulse. But for somebody that's got ADHD, it's a frequent, very often multiple times a day struggle with all of these things. And so often we'll be told some variation of, if only you would just try harder. Try harder to pay attention. Try harder to remember where you put something. Try harder to control yourself. Or, especially for me, try not to leave everything to the last minute. But you remember what I said about it being an executive dysfunction? A developmental difference with the way our brains are wired. It's a lack of function, not a lack of effort. And to make things harder, ADHD is often what's called comorbid with other conditions. About 80% of ADHDers are diagnosed with at least one other psychiatric disorder at some point during their life. And the most common ones are learning disabilities, anxiety, me, depression, me again, as you'll see later, sensory processing disorder, and even oppositional defiant disorder. But all of these are generalities about people with ADHD. So how has it affected me personally? Well, I said my biggest challenge is procrastination. And I told you the university story earlier, but we're in a work environment, so I want to give you a more direct work-related story. It was 1995, and bonus points if anybody can tell me what that TV show is. Xena Warrior Princess, which first came out in 1995. I was looking for a picture to represent the year. And I was 3 years into my first job with IBM. And I had a very lovely female manager at the time, and she pulled me in for my, whatever it was, 6-monthly review and said, look, no problem with your work, what you're doing is great, very happy with your output, but there is something I've noticed. You do appear, at least from the outside, to spend quite a lot of time doing not very much, and then at the last minute you put your foot, accelerator flat to the floor, and you deliver. And if that works for you, that's fine, but please be aware that not everybody else around you can do the same thing. So just be aware of the impact that you have on other people. So again, showing that kind of issue that I have with procrastination. And in my personal life, it's caused much bigger problems. Pretty much everyone that has ADHD is aware of what's often referred to as the ADHD tax. This is where you end up having to spend more money, or it costs you more money, because it might be things like late fees because you've missed a credit card payment, or you're late giving a library book back. Or you might have to buy a replacement item because you've forgotten where you put the previous one that you bought. There's lots of different ways that it can impact, but it ends up costing you more money. Now, I'm not going to go into the full story here, but back in 2009, procrastination combined with impulsivity and wanting to avoid conflict, and I ended up in some really very significant financial difficulties, led to the breakdown of my first marriage, having to sell our house, and me ending up suicidal. I said about depressed. So yes, ADHD has had some pretty nasty downsides for me through my life. Obviously, at this point, I didn't realise that was what it was. But after all that, and I know that's a little bit of a downer, you'll be pleased to hear that there are good things about having ADHD as well. And as anyone who's known me for any length of time will tell you, and I get this comment regularly, including from Yuraka, I'm always juggling multiple different things. So at the moment, I'm running multiple trainings inside EPAM. I'm doing copy editing. I'm doing mentoring. I'm facilitating community day events. I'm participating in community events like this. I'm intensely curious and I love learning new things. And because of that very broad range of interests, that means it helps me make connections and see solutions very, very quickly. And despite leaving things to the last minute, like this presentation, which I finished just after midnight last night with a few minor tweaks this morning, I hope you can agree I can usually deliver a pretty good result. So how do I stop my life being a complete disaster zone? There's a bunch of coping mechanisms that I've learned. Obviously, I'm only having recently realised it's ADHD, but these are things I've been doing for a long time because I've figured out that they work for me, and perhaps they might work for you as well. First, put as much as you can on autopilot. That means direct debits, standing orders, subscriptions. A big one for me, always put things in the same place as much as possible so you know where to look for it. So keys, tape measures, medicines. Basically, the more things in your life that you can remove the need to think or remember or get up the motivation to do, the better. So, for example, and this is, even if you haven't got ADHD, this is a good tip. When you're putting something away, ask yourself, where will be the first place I look for it in 6 months' time when I've forgotten where I put it? And put it there. Because again, it removes that cognitive load. My wife's got into the habit of this and has gone, oh, this works. Yes. Don't just stick it in the first random drawer that you come across. The next one is put everything in the calendar, and I mean everything, with multiple reminders. So if I put calendar things, and I'll have a reminder, depending what it is, maybe an hour before, the day before, a week before, and 2 weeks before. Or if it's something like, you know, renew my house insurance, it'll have reminders at 4 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, 3 days. So I'm getting prompted all the time. Everything's on my phone, everything's in my calendar. My calendar's visible to my wife. And anything that affects her as well, I invite her to the calendar event. So she gets reminders. You know, things like doing flea treatments for the dog. If it's not in my calendar, it's not going to happen. And that is tied to one of the common ADHD challenges, which is time blindness. For somebody with ADHD, everything is either now or not now. There's nothing in between. So if you want me to do something, either ask me now and let me do it now. Don't ask me now and ask me to do it later. That's not going to happen unless it goes in the diary. And also, if it is something that's a bit further out, put intermediate reminders and check-ins. So we did this when we were preparing this presentation. I was very honest with you, and I'm increasingly doing this with people I'm working with. So even though I did actually leave the building of the slide deck to kind of the last minute, I knew that was what was going to happen. I told Uretta that was what was going to happen. So but what we had was an intermediate check-in last week where I had to at least present the structure of what I was going to do last week. So I've had actually done some preparation, and what I've realised now is, even though I may not put fingers to keyboard until the end, there's actually been a lot of thinking. It's been chuntering away in the back of my head for a week or 2 weeks, actually, in terms of what I'm doing. So it's not quite as last minute as sometimes it might appear. So I was reminded yesterday to find the slides. I'd already started doing that. So we got it done. And the big one for me, since realising that this is just how my brain is wired, is stop beating myself up. My brain is just wired differently. And I will always need to have a variety of different things to swap between just to keep my brain interested. I'm never going to be able to concentrate on just one thing unless it is something novel and interesting. And then I can get into hyper focus and spend a lot of time on it. And I'll usually do stuff in bursts, probably just before it needs to be done, but that's okay. So if any of this sounds like you, there's a link on the screen. You can scan the QR code if you want to. That's just a kind of quick screening survey to tell you whether perhaps you may have ADHD or not. And if you want to chat about it, please do get in touch. And that's it.